So welcome everyone to the Secret Life of Honeybees with Colette Mesher. Hopefully we're at the right session. My name is CJ and I'm going to be your Zoom host from Transition Guelph. We are thrilled to have everybody be a part of this 10th annual Resilience Festival. It's actually our first time we're holding it virtually, so thanks everybody for your patience as we kind of work through everything. I encourage everybody to visit the website for other great events going on today. We have our CD Saturday virtual market. And before I continue to introduce our speaker, there are a few housekeeping items. The first is if everybody can please stay on mute to minimize disruptions. For this session, questions and comments, you can ask them in the chat function, or you could also put your hands up throughout the presentation and I'll unmute you to ask your question, or I'll ask you to unmute. And also, yeah, I guess please be respectful, kind, and generous during the session. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Colette. Colette is a biologist who loves bees and horses. And as the principal beekeeper of Miel Rebel Honey, she focuses on local honey harvested and extracted by hand, as well as other hive products. And I'm looking forward to learning. Welcome, Colette.
Well, thank you very much, CJ, and thank you for organizing all of this. I know that it does take a lot, even though virtually sometimes seems a little bit easier. I know there's a lot that goes on in the background as I organize conferences myself. So I do appreciate everything that the Resilience Festival does to keep our community going during these very challenging times. So thank you for the introduction. Yes, my name is Colette, and I am based here in Guelph. So Miel Rebel Honey, the name just comes from the fact that I actually was born and grew up in Montreal, and my sister designed my logo knowing me so well and decided to include both the French and English, and it's actually been a really big part of how I've moved forward with my company. And so again, as with technology, my computer is old and does its best, but doesn't always respond the way I want it to. So hopefully it'll be all going okay, but I do have a backup if anything were to go wrong. Right, so hopefully everyone can hear me well and can see my PowerPoint presentation. If there's any issues, just pop that in the Q&A for CJ to kind of give me a wave to let me know if I'm talking too fast or you can't hear me. So as I said, I'm based here in Guelph, but I keep hives in a huge, actually, circumference from where I live. And it just it happens naturally where I meet people who are landowners or who wish to have hives in their backyards or whatever it is. And I'm always happy to try and find a new location where the bees can live happily. I accidentally fell into honeybees. I am trained as an aquatic biologist, really, and I have always worked with invertebrates, so animals without spines. So after a number of years working with aquatic animals, I heard about honeybees. All my students were talking about this great course at the University of Guelph, and I thought, that might be interesting. And it really changed the course of my life. And I've devoted myself to learning everything that I can about honeybees because they really are endlessly fascinating. All right, so I sometimes have to go back and forth, get the slide. There we go. So one of the biggest questions that I have from people is this a honeybee? I have honeybees on my balcony, on my roof trusses, whatever it is. And I want all of you to have a look at these pictures and tell me, now that they're close up and they're big and they're sitting still, do you think this is a bee? So both of these actually are, yeah. So on the left here is the paper wasp that make those beautiful nests. And on the right here are the yellow jackets. So these are the most common yellow flying insects that people get confused with bees. And last year in particular, I think it was the weather conditions that really kind of made things come together, and yellow jackets were unbelievably numerous. I think it was the warm weather as well, and combined with a few other things that really made their population boom last year. And there were so many of them around, and they really genuinely do confuse people and make them think that they're actually honeybees. Now, yellow jackets are pollinators. They're not very good pollinators. And as you can see in these photos here, they're very smooth wasps, right? They don't have any hairs on them. So although they can pollinate because they fly from flower to flower, they don't actually pollinate very well because they don't carry much pollen because there's not a lot of hair on their back. So have a look at this springtime. The queens are gonna start coming out again and gonna start building nests. So have a really good look if you can safely and see if you can start to tell the difference between wasps and bees. So what is the big difference honeybees are from other types of bees? So what you can see here on the left is a drone bee, a queen bee, and a worker bee. Now it's really important that the structure, you kind of understand these different castes or types of honeybees, because it's really central to why honeybees are different from other types of bees. So all honeybees start like this. Those tiny little grains of rice that are in there, those are eggs. So those are laid by the queen, and those will eventually become worker bees. I know that for a variety of reasons, because I also took this photo, but just to give you an idea, from this tiny little grain of rice comes out what is essentially an enormous hive. So what you really need to start for a honeybee colony is a queen. There generally is only going to be one per hive. And they used to live up to 5 years, but now with changing climates and these really wild swings in climates and year to year, some huge variations, as well as pesticides and just lots of different pressures on honeybees, queens generally only last about 3 years. And it will be that same 3 years with the same hive, the same colony. And she is essentially the mother of the colony. She'll be the only one laying those tiny little grains of rice, eggs in the colony. And worker bees are the ones that literally do all of the work in the hive. They also happen to be all female. So they have a lifespan in the summer of about 6 weeks. And that's because flying is a very dangerous activity. So as soon as a bee leaves a hive, leaves their home, they're at risk of rain, wind, birds, any other predators that will come along and eat them. So it's actually the last task that they do is they spend a lot more of their life inside the hive, and it's only the last few days to weeks that they will actually become a forager and leave their home. However, over winter, because they don't fly very much and because they don't forage flowers, they can actually last up to 6 months. So the honeybees that you're seeing right now on flowers, mostly trees right now. There's not a huge amount of flowers. There are crocuses out right now, but mostly it's trees right now that are producing pollen. And if you see any honeybees on them, they're very likely going to be the winter bees because the queen is only just starting to lay. So they don't hibernate per se, they just stay inside their hive and stay warm for all winter and then emerge again in the spring when they have actual resources to go and collect. And as I said, the worker bees they do all the work in the hive, from cleaning to feeding to protecting the hive. The worker bees do all of that. And that's because these worker bees, they have a stinger. The reason it's important that they're female is because it has to do with their the way that they reproduce. They are controlled to not produce eggs, but they have a stinger in order to protect the hive, and it's an evolutionary trait that is linked to females of the bees. So these workers can defend, they can sting, and they actually have a barbed stinger. So it's like a hypodermic needle, but it has barbs on it. So when the bee stings you or a predator, it actually rips the stinger out of the honeybee, killing her. So she only wants to sting you when it has to, right? Because she's sacrificing her life, and she'll do that to protect the hive, but she doesn't want to do that. But that's a big difference with wasps, is that wasps don't have barbs on their stingers, so they have the ability to sting you multiple times. So that's why poor bees do get a very bad reputation for being mean or aggressive, and it's actually much more likely to have been a wasp that stings you and makes you a little bit afraid of them. And it's because of that, the difference between having barbs or no barbs. So they're much more likely to sting because they're not sacrificing their lives. All right, and the final type of honeybee is the drone bee. They are only produced in the summer. And they don't have stingers. They're safe little fuzzy bees that you can go up to and just stroke if you ever were to find one. And they live between 3 and 6 months. They really only live for the summer season because that's the only time there is excess food, where the queen feels safe and the hive feels safe producing something that will only take from the hive. The drone bees don't collect nectar or produce anything. They actually just go around begging their sisters for food in order to stay alive, because their sole job is to pass the queen's genetics on to the next generation. That's literally, and if they succeed, then they die. So it's actually kind of a tragic life for a male bee, but that is just the way that they have evolved. And they're kind of a funny little thing to work with, because they're not very bright. They only fly well long distances. So around a hive, they tend to bumble around and fall over and be kind of silly looking. But they have very big eyes to see queen bees in order to go and mate with them in flight. So they are an interesting little section of the hive, and very important for passing along the queen's genetics, but don't actually do anything to keep the colony, to keep the house of the bees going. Right, so the big key things about honeybees, as I mentioned earlier, so if you take a look at this photo, you can see that around the heads of the bees, they're really fuzzy. And the older the bee gets, the less hair they'll have. But when they're born, we refer to them as bedheads, because they actually emerge from the cell and they look like they've just woken up from a really long sleep, and their hair is all smushed. And eventually they fluff it up, and that's actually what makes them really good pollinators. So if you remember that first slide where there are wasps, were really naked looking, like almost sleek looking, because they don't have hair. Whereas honeybees and bumblebees and a lot of the solitary bees are very fuzzy, and pollen sticks to them. So even if they don't collect pollen, the pollen is sticking to those hairs, and they're able to pollinate by going flower to flower to flower, or tree to tree to tree. So another big thing that honeybees are a little different is that they live in these colonies. They live in these structures that you have the main queen, you have all of her workers, and then you have the drones in the summer. So they're one small unit, which is very easy to kind of manipulate in terms of an agriculture, in terms of a farming viewpoint. They live in these controlled colonies that are easy to manipulate, whereas bumblebees tend to live in these much more complex, spread out, and in some ways smaller colonies, where you can have multiple queens and multiple workers. And big thing here, bumblebees are fantastic pollinators, unbelievably great. Like, I think tomatoes can only be pollinated by bumblebees because of the way that at the rate at which they beat their wings. Certain plants can only be pollinated by that rate. So that's why they're such fantastic pollinators, and why it's so important to protect them. But what bumblebees don't do is they don't produce excess honey. And before I move on to the next slide, I just want to point out, because this is a really nice photo, is that you can see that queen bee, how she looks quite different. This one does have a green dot on her. That was to make it easy for me to identify the queen in a hive of 60,000 bees. But you can really see in this photos that all of these are her daughters around her. They're all the worker bees, and the queen bee is in the middle there, and she's walking around laying eggs, and they're tending her and tending to all the babies around. So it just gives you kind of a visual size difference. The queens are bigger than the worker bees, but there's only one of her, and she can be very hard to find. So that's why I have that little green dot there. All right, so, oh yes, and so this is a little slow-mo video of a bumblebee to give you that good idea of what exactly, just how fat and fuzzy. So it's a slow-mo video, obviously. This is the lavender in my front garden, and how she's going flower to flower, and those wings, that beating of the wings is what disturbs the pollen, and they feed on the nectar and disturb the pollen, and they pass it flower to flower. And this is why bumblebees are such fantastic pollinators, and why it's so great that they and it's so important to protect them. So yeah, that's where you can really see that fuzziness, whereas honeybees don't tend to have the fuzziness on their abdomen, their lower part of their body. Bumblebees really are covered in hairs head to foot, which is why it makes them such incredible pollinators. But of course, we prefer the honeybees because they live in hives in these structures where they can really blossom. So what you can see here, right, this is an example of a hive at the peak of summer. So the very bottom box at the bottom where all these bees are bearding, where they're so hot and there's so many of them in the hive that they actually sit out front fanning the air into the hive. And all of these up here, this would all be honey supers. So a place where they would put excess honey. And that's why, even though in nature and not in where these bees live naturally, they would be the size of a basketball, would be the size of their colony. But in summer, when there's a ton of nectar around, so basically the sugary water they get from flowers, they can completely explode. They can have 60,000 bees in this box right here, and all of them are collecting nectar and putting it into these boxes. So even though bumblebees can be better and more efficient pollinators, honeybees are happy to live in these structures that work well for farmers, for beekeepers to move them around, or to just have them in your backyard and be able to collect that honey. So, and just as a note here, nectar is the watery, sugary stuff that you get from flowers. The bees take that back to the hive, regurgitate it into the comb, and then fan with their wings until the moisture content is 18% or lower, and then it turns it into honey. And it's that manipulation of the bees, they do manipulate it and add enzymes to it that actually converts it from the nectar of the flowers, which is really just sugary water, into the product that we actually know as honey. So that's why it's so important to have so many flowers around, because you have to think each bee only produces a quarter of a teaspoon of honey in her lifetime. So you need 60,000 bees if you want to fill this much honey, if you want to have excess honey from the colony to be able to use for yourself or to sell. So yes, here's the excess honey for harvest. So this is what I mean by a honey frame, whereas they're actually just going to be storing that nectar. And then once it is dry enough, they cover it with wax. And that's what the beekeeper collects. And you can have it as comb honey, so just literally within the wax, or you can take it out of the comb and then have it as a jar of honey. So that's actually where it comes from and why there's such an interest in honeybees, because not only can they really lovely to work with, they also can be a way to make some money and to enjoy basically their harvest. So I always have to throw this in here just to be super clear. So this honeybee movie, Jerry Seinfeld, very, very incorrect. So if you think back to what I was describing, the queen bee, the worker bee, and the drone bee. So Jerry Seinfeld, he would be a drone bee. He wouldn't have a job other than to fly outside the hive and mate with queens. That's it. So the premise of the whole movie really bothered me as a beekeeper because he's a male. He's a drone. He doesn't have a job to choose from. He doesn't need to be big and tough to fly out of the hive. I really wish they had done it in reverse, that Jerry Seinfeld was the human love interest, and the bee was Renee Zellweger, because then it actually would have been at least biologically sensible. I mean, I realize that honeybees don't talk, but it really drove me crazy that they decided to reverse those roles, because females do all the work. Females are the big tough ones that defend the hive, and they fly out of the hive and go and do all those dangerous jobs that could lead to them dying. So it always really bothered me that they decided to swap those roles. And I always tell people that this bee movie was wrong, because it really is, it's an all female led colony. And that's just important because they have stingers. Drone bees don't have stingers, so they can't defend the hive. All right. So going back to that idea of the reason honeybees are so great and why we're so interested in them is because you can keep them in these different locations. So the honeybees that we work with are Apis mellifera, and it actually is the European honeybee. So they aren't a native species to Canada, North America at all. They are from England, France, Germany. They are from Europe. They have been in Canada for many hundreds of years, but they really are still the original species that never did exist here. So it is very important as a beekeeper to choose your hive setup so that you can care for them, so that you don't pass diseases on to native pollinators like bumblebees. And there is lots of choices out there. This is the most common one. This is the Langstroth hive. It is the most common kind of setup that you will see in North America, but all over the world, there are many different ways to keep bees. This is a log hive up in this left-hand corner with circular frames, and the whole colony lives in one space with their honey and their brood, which is the baby bees, all together in one space. In the center here is what is referred to as a woven skep. You might see that word sometimes if you're ever looking at beekeeping, or you can see the little skep candles that are sold at the Guelph Farmers Market. Is that this is a very ancient traditional way to keep bees. The only issue with this is that you can't inspect this hive. You can't look into the hive without destroying it. So you actually have to cut open this skep in order to get the honey out. So that's why there was the evolution of these different choices, because you have the need you want to keep your bees alive, but you also want to check on them and get honey from them. So we moved away from the woven skep a number of years ago once we were able to develop some kind of way to manipulate the bees. So Winnie the Pooh, I'm sure, turned a lot of people on or off of honeybees, but that is how they would live. They would live traditionally in a cavity in a tree or something like that, which is why honeybees will often end up in people's houses, especially warm places, like California or Georgia or something. You'll see these massive beehives inside of people's walls because it's nice and warm and they can live in there easily. And it's a very traditional way for them to live, is they would find a safe, easy to defend location, like Winnie the Pooh was able to, he's that big entrance, right? The bees are able to defend it, and that's where they would live. So we've been able to kind of manipulate that for our own purposes for people. But what do all of these things have in common, from the hole in the tree to the skep, the log hive, to the kind of box Langstroth hive? They have one big thing in common. It's that it's dark inside. So if you visualize a honeybee inside the hive, so all of these pieces are closed together, that it's dark in there. They can't see. So how is it that the bees even talk to each other, right? So yes, the worker bees will fly in and out, but the queen is in here. All of the baby bees that are born with their hair smooshed, they've never been outside. They've never even seen daylight. Everything is dark in there. So how is it that bees even communicate with each other, or how do they even know the outside world is there, basically? So because the spring has actually come very nicely this year, I didn't know what to expect, but 20 degrees at the end of March was not it. So I was actually able to go out last week and check on some of my hives. And yeah, and so this is one of the bigger hives that I was able to check on, and you can see the box is full of bees. And obviously I'm letting light in now because I've removed that lid. And so all these bees, they were in the dark before, right? How is it that they are even talking to each other? How is it they're able to form this colony and keep the queen safe and make all this honey? So, yeah, and they make a tremendous amount of noise when you open them up like that. And if you put in pheromone to Google, what comes up is a honeybee. So another way that bees communicate in the dark is pheromone. And pheromones are just basically fancy perfumes that the bees themselves can emit. You can see here in this picture, this tiny little gland that she has actually opened on the back of her bum. So her stinger is out here, and this is referred to as the Nazimov gland. And whenever I open the hive, so that first video where you see all the bees on top, so whenever I remove that lid and I let that light in the hive, a whole bunch of the bees will open up their Nazimov gland, and it signals to any bees outside of the hive, as well as bees inside of the hive, that something is changed, something is different, and that they should come home. So it's a way to call in their defenses because they think something is happening to their house, which obviously is, because I'm taking apart their house. in order to inspect them and check on them. So that's a really big way that they communicate, is that they put these pheromones out into the hive. So again, if you think about the whole box being dark, they are able to communicate with each other, and it's very important. So the queen herself, the biggest bee in the hive, she actually has a pheromone that she releases from her mouth parts, and it suppresses the ovaries of all of her daughters. So in theory, any bee that is in the hive can become a queen, because they are all from a fertilized egg. Those drone bees, those boy bees, they are from an unfertilized egg. Whereas most of the hive is composed of fertilized eggs, who are the worker bees, or a queen bee who is fed a little differently and allowed to grow in a different way, and that makes her bigger and makes her ovaries functional. But a big part of that is that queen mandibular pheromone, the one that she's releasing from her mouth parts, actually suppresses the ovaries in the babies. So she's communicating to them, I am the queen, I am laying the eggs, everything is fine. And the worker bees will actually pass that pheromone around. The ones that attend to the queen, who are closest to her, pick up that pheromone, and then they pass it to the sister, who passes to the sister. So it's very important for those queens to have a very strong pheromone, very strong perfume all the time, because after 3 years, so like I said at the beginning of the presentation, the queen's going to live between 3 and 5 years. So maybe at the end of the second season, maybe at the end of the third, you might get lucky, maybe at the beginning of the fourth, the queen's getting older and her pheromone won't be as strong. So it won't be, so when it's past, say, the 5th time, the 10th time, it will be weakened. And the bees that have less contact with the queen, maybe the foragers, will come back and be like, doesn't smell like the queen in here. There's something wrong. We want a big, strong queen who controls the colony with her pheromones, because it suppresses everyone else and everyone feels very secure because they know what their roles are. So that queen pheromone is very important for it to be strong and spread throughout the hive. And you have to imagine, okay, a basketball size, that's pretty easy for the queen to control. But now think about the peak of summer, where you have 4 or 5 honey supers on top of that hive. So you have this big tower. The queen's pheromone needs to be spread throughout that gigantic space. And so that's why having younger queens that are very strong and produce a lot of pheromones, very important way to communicate things, that everything is fine, we still have a queen, and we'll still continue on as a colony. Because the colonies are a unit. An individual bee cannot live on her own. An individual queen cannot survive on her own. So it's really important to think of them as one singular organism, because without each other, there is no colony. They must all work together as a unit. And that's why it's so important for them to have that strong queen. And most famously, they have an alarm pheromone. So the reason that bees sting is because they've either been threatened, or their sisters feel threatened and release an alarm pheromone. And so if I were to walk up to my hive and just pull the lid off and not give them any warning, I very likely would get stung. And that's because and then as soon as I get stung, that releases the alarm pheromone. It tells their sisters, I have sacrificed my life to protect us. You need to be aware something is wrong. So that can spread throughout the hive. So that's why you get these crazy stories of the Africanized bees, which thankfully cannot survive in our Canadian winters. So I'm very grateful. They might be down in California and Mexico, but they can't make their way up here. But Africanized honeybees are very, very aggressive and can be dangerous to people because they sting much more easily and will chase people. Whereas honeybees that are here, that are basically well tended here in Canada, we specifically select genetics for gentleness, because I have hives in urban areas on rooftops. So it's really important for me that I have very gentle, very friendly bees that do not want to sting. So especially in Ontario, we have a very big breeding program that aims to control how much aggression is in the colony, so that people can keep very nice, gentle bees, and it's much more enjoyable that way. So that alarm pheromone, as a beekeeper, I actually suppress it. So I cover it up. I cover up their perfume by using a smoker. So it's not hot smoke, it's cold smoke. You you start a fire and then you smother it so that the smoke that you're blowing on the bees is covered up. It covers up the alarm pheromone, because it can be pretty shocking to go from a completely dark space to a suddenly bright sunshine, really warm, bright, sunny day. All of that light is flooding in, and the queen actually hates light. She is afraid of the light, almost phobic of the light. So she actually moves away into dark corners when exposed extensively to light. So you actually want to go in and calm the bees down and say, it's okay, I've come to check on you. And you cover up the alarm pheromone with your smoker. Now there is an old wives' tale that talks about using smoke as mimicking a forest fire, and that forest fire causes the bees to go and eat honey, and it makes them more docile. There is actually no research that indicates that this is the case. It really is more about the covering up the pheromones and keeping the bees calm. So that's what I use as a beekeeper. So when I do expose them to light, they remain calm. Oh, yes, the waggle dance. So this is the kind of last type of behavior that I'm going to go over in terms of how the bees communicate. And that very first hive that I showed you when I showed you the different types of hives, that Langstroth hive, it's actually a flow hive. And that's the Australian type of hive where you can extract honey right at the box with the bees. And they actually have amazing videographers at Flow, and this is one of their videos to show you the waggle dance. So you got to think they're talking to each other, quacking and tooting and doing all sorts of booping. They are talking to each other with pheromones, with perfumes, communicating all sorts of messages, but they also do physical dances in order to tell each other where a good source of nectar, of pollen is. So this is a great little video. Hopefully it will load. So you can see the bees closest to her are physically following her and touching her as she moves around. So that little waggle dance they've actually discussed, researchers have studied it enough to know that they're actually telling you the angle to the sun and the distance you have to fly to find this resource. So when a bee is super excited and she comes into the hive and she shakes her bum so hard to get as many of her sisters to pay attention to her, and she'll do it over and over and over again until her sisters understand where the flowers are located that are a really good new resource. So you have to think bees are just leaving the hive and flying randomly. They're just looking for stuff, right? They're looking for colors, right? Because they can only see certain colors, like they can't see red, but they can see certain colors like the blues and the greens and the yellows. They can see those. They're looking for those. So you will see bees land on plastic flowers because it's the right color, but then they get there and like, this smells wrong, this tastes wrong, and then they leave. Right? So bees are just randomly flying, but when they do find a random resource that is wonderful, whether it's someone's garden or a giant field of canola, they will quickly come back to the hive and very excitedly tell her sisters. So again, you can imagine when they're in that dark box, even though they can't see her, if they can get close to her and touch her and feel how many times she does little circles and how much she shakes her bum, it actually tells them, ooh, there's a really great resource over in that direction. So I'm going to go fly over there for however long she tells me to at whatever angle, and I'm going to be able to find that resource as well. So bees have just an unending way to communicate in such a challenging world. And I'm fascinated about the fact that they allow us to keep them. They are happy to live in the boxes that we give them and put up with the fact that we take honey from them or we manipulate their frames, because their imperative is just that. Their needs are met by living in a box or a tree trunk or whatever it ends up being, and they just continue on with their lives, right? They're insects. They don't have a I'm happy, I'm sad response. They just have a I need to take care of my queen. My queen needs to pass on her genetics. So they want to do these things just because it's their biological imperative. So the fact that honeybees are so friendly and are such incredible workers, it's really is amazing and not really surprising that they've developed so many different ways to communicate and pass along information in a simple enough way that they can actually share the information throughout this amazing colony of 60,000 bees. Go. So, but beekeeping is a wonderful hobby, and it started as a bit of a hobby and then turned into a job, and now I have my own company. So I would always recommend and endlessly talk to people about beekeeping, but it isn't for everyone. I beekeep like this. I wear just a veil and a t-shirt and jeans, and I'm comfortable. But like I say, I keep very gentle bees on purpose because this picture is actually from where I showed a friend's daughter who was 10 years old at the time, what it was like inside of a beehive. So I need these very sweet, very gentle honeybees, and which is also allows me to work like this, to not have to be kind of covered up in lots of layers. Because not everyone is comfortable working with honeybees, right? They do sting. That is just a fact. I get stung all the time. And thankfully for me, I have a very good reaction to being stung, and that it doesn't bother me. So even if I do get stung, it's not a big deal. So, but it isn't a hobby that everyone can experience. Oh, and before I continue on that topic, just because this is going to come up again this summer, last summer we had a big scare because out in British Columbia, they found the Asian giant hornet, or murder hornet. The newspapers jumped all over this because our lives aren't complicated enough in a pandemic. Let's just throw some murder hornets in there. So I just wanted to address this, that murder hornets are a thing. They're real. They can stalk a honeybee hive, and they can kill it. They can take over and kill the honeybee hive. So these are scary. And I'm sure that if you got stung by this giant insect, it would hurt so bad. However, they are nowhere near Ontario. You will not see these things. If you see a giant hornet, it is likely a different species, not the murder hornet, because there are some very large insects that you don't even realize exist until stories like this come up, and then people make reports and the government goes, oh, no, 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 no. Those have been here for decades. They're fine. They don't bother honeybees. So they are in British Columbia, and they do have a plan between Seattle and Vancouver to eradicate these potentially very dangerous insects, both to people and to honeybees. But please don't worry, they are not here in Ontario. There is nothing for them to worry about. Right, so if murder hornets throw you off and you think, wow, I never wanted to get into honeybees, there is still so many different things that you can do to support pollinators in general. So first of all, in your backyard, there is an incredible amount. So one day last year, I just went out to my garden. So the bumblebee over here, this is in my front pollinator garden. I planted a whole bunch of pollinator plants, and I go out there every day and I take slow-mo videos and great little pictures of just different pollinators that like to come and visit my plants. You have the woolly bear here in the bottom. And of course, there's a lot of these little moths, these little caterpillars that are going to turn into moths in the leaf litter right now. And I know it's 20 degrees and everyone was so happy last weekend and cleaning their gardens. Please don't. Until it is consistently double digits during the day, these guys, like little woolly bears, they can't survive. They need to stay hibernating. They need that leaf litter. So if you do need to feel the compulsion to clean up your garden, don't throw it all away. Put it all in a pile in a corner, that once the weather truly warms up and remains consistently warm and the butterflies and everything are back out, then you can get rid of it. But leaf litter is incredibly important to overwintering pollinators. So please don't get rid of all of it if you can. I leave as much on the ground as possible until it really does warm up. And these were just my raspberry bushes in the backyard. Just butterflies come and visit all the time. So there's a great way to interact with insects in nature and not ever feel stressed or worried or concerned, because all of these, this is my house in Guelph. This is, a 5-minute excursion in Guelph. So you really can interact with insects very easily. And one of the ways, another ways that you can help them is to create space for pollinators. So these adorable little cups are for bumblebees to drink for water. So you can put water sources out. So maybe you don't want to have like little plastic bottle caps in your garden. You can actually set up really beautiful water sources. So you always want to make sure that there's rocks or something for the insects to land on, because most insects are terrible swimmers. As soon as they touch water, that's it. The surface tension sucks them in and they can't get back out. So you definitely want to have something for them to land on. That's why these bottle caps are great, because they don't tend to get very deep. And there's lots of stuff for their tiny little feet to hold on to. But down here, these bowls with the rocks, that's a really great way to help pollinators and help bees of all kinds. And you'll also see a lot of these kind of mason houses. They're very common at like Home Depot and things like that. And they are great. I would just advise you to buy one where you can replace or at least remove these tubes. So parasites, unfortunately, are everywhere. Solitary bees absolutely love these little tubes and will lay their eggs in them. But you have to think they're going to have more than one generation over the year, one chance to lay over the year. And if they keep using the same tubes over and over and over again, you increase the risk of bacteria and viruses being transmitted between species and between the different eggs. So it's a good idea, if you had one of these out last year, replace the tubes that are in there. And having one that has an overhang so that the water doesn't drip in them. Because imagine if you laid an egg in there and you put pollen and food and then you leave it alone, you don't want it to get all wet and moldy in there. So you want to make sure that the tubes themselves, water can't get in. And that there's lots of aeration around it so that it doesn't get really dank and kind of moldy in there. But these mason houses are a great way to see iridescent, very small pollinators. Again, a little bit harder to find, but they really are beautiful, beautiful bees. There are some pretty incredible, there are over 300 species of bees in Ontario. So I'm sure there are many more in your garden than you even realize. So giving them bees a place to kind of live and come and visit in your garden is a great way to interact with bees without actually keeping a honeybee colony in your backyard. And of course, flowers are amazing for pollinators, not just honeybees. If you walk anywhere in Guelph, you're going to see honeybees. There's a lot of honeybees in Guelph because of the university, because the Ontario Beekeepers Association is here in Guelph. And what I love is that I can actually often tell when other bees are visiting my flowers, because I know the colors of my bees that I have. And I'll often see a completely different color bee and I'm like, you are not mine, you are from someone else's hive. But I find it such a joy to have flowers in my garden, because the sedums in the fall, it's one of the last things to blossom, one of the last things to provide any kind of food source for bees. So you'll see an incredible amount of different pollinators on there. Lavenders, again, has very long bloom periods. It's wonderful to smell the lavender plant, as well as just sit next to it and see what comes to visit it. In this bottom right-hand corner is the maple tree. I have a massive maple tree in the back of in my backyard. And when it blossoms, it's so much fun to go out and just see what's visiting. Because again, you're not just going to get honeybees, you're going to get a ton of different bees, as well as dandelions. I know people don't like dandelions because they're a weed, but weeds are just a plant in the wrong place, right? And then I would ask people, if you can, leave the dandelions at least for a little bit, maybe not for them to go to seed, but I leave them because they are, although not the best source of pollen, they are a good early source of pollen for all sorts of bees, including honeybees. So if you can leave them for a little bit, the bees will thank you for it. And a beekeeper will definitely thank you for it, because it is very challenging at this time of year. You think, oh, it's 20 degrees, it's wonderful. But flowers are not going to be blooming for weeks and weeks and weeks. So yes, we have the trees and the bushes, but dandelions really do provide that stopgap when we have a bit of a dearth in between when trees blossom to when flowers really start coming out and producing nectar to push the honeybees along to build up that colony. The dandelions are often a really important resource for that. Then of course the echinacea plant, same thing. They're a wonderful plant to take photos of bees on because they're very flat plant. They don't go inside like the lavender plants. They're very flat, so the bees land on the top of them. So it's actually a really nice way to get a good photo of bees. So there are lots of different ways for people to interact with insects, interact with bees, interact with honeybees without actually keeping a colony yourself. If you think, ooh, that's a little intimidating, there are lots of different ways. And don't forget as well, is that whenever I sell my honey, I always get the question, is that what do you do with it other than tea? And you think, but there's so many different things to do with honey, and that's a huge benefit to being a beekeeper, is that I get to play with honey. I get to add flavors. I get to cook with it because I have so much of it. But I also want to encourage people and create recipes and kind of create the idea for people that really sugar isn't the only way to sweeten things. There is lots of honey and there are lots of benefits to honey. So for me, as you can see from my enthusiasm, I'm a huge fan of honeybees. I love teaching about honeybees. I love sharing my passion for bees in general because they really are fascinating creatures. I do post instructional videos on my YouTube channel. That's one of my goals for the summer, is to produce more. They're freely available because I'm always updating my content, and I want it to be out there. I want to share that information. So if you do want to learn more in-depth things about honeybees, even if it's something as simple as lighting a smoker for your hive, if you were to get one, there are videos there, as well as the University of Guelph has produced an incredible set of videos as well. There's lots of information out there. Kind of fall down a rabbit hole level of information. So if you are interested in learning more about honeybees, feel free to contact me or look at the videos or go to the University of Guelph apiculture. They all have some really great videos that can give you an idea of what it's like to keep bees and if you're interested in it. Okay. Hi, it's Colette. Go. And one of the big perks that I have as a beekeeper is that I get to hang out with really cool animals and people all the time. So I take my friend's French bulldog with me sometimes, my horse. I'm able to ride her past my beehives. I have cats that are fearless and come and climb on my hives. And last year I had a really great experience up at Walden. I had a grandparents' day where I was able to have grandparents and grandchildren and expose them to honeybees, and they had an awesome time. So there are lots of different ways to interact with honeybees and lots of opportunities for you to kind of enjoy it. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me if you don't feel like asking them now, or anything else. Feel free to pass along my information or contact me on my website or through my email.